Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael Pollan, for being here. I speak on behalf of this entire room, who seems incredibly excited at your presence.
Well, it's great to be here, and this beautiful room.
Yeah, this is a wonderful place, especially for this conversation.
Yes, it's got...
about changing our minds.
Well, it has spiritual implications.
Yes, it does, and I want to come to that. I was thinking with Philip's remarks that this is just the kind of program that Scott Falk would have been deeply engaged with. He's a lawyer, and he would have had lots of questions and thoughts about policy. And so I will do my best to honor his spirit, channel him in my questions tonight. But I want to say that I have so many questions for you because this is a remarkable book. It's just fabulous, and thank you so much for writing it and for bringing this history back to us. And I wanted to start, though, not with the history that you're writing about here, but something more recent. You wrote an op-ed for the New York Times after Denver made the move to decriminalize psilocybin. And, this is a book that extols the potential of psychedelics for science, medicine, for our spirituality, for religion. It has the potential to treat addiction, depression, really gain purchase on things that really hamper our lives that other drugs have not been able to do. So it's sort of in praise of psychedelics, right? But you, in your op-ed, cautioned we should go slowly around legalizing.
Yeah.
Why? Why are you concerned about decriminalization?
Well, it was actually a tough call because what happened in Denver was there was a vote in the county of Denver, and it basically instructed, it's not quite decriminalization, it'll still be illegal, but to make it the lowest priority for the police to go after people in possession or using or growing psilocybin, which is magic mushrooms. And, I studied the history very closely, and we had this period of incredible and somewhat irrational exuberance around psychedelics in the 60s that ended up killing off what had been this very promising research project. And they were used, sometimes very constructively, but also recklessly, and in a way that kind of frightened the powers that be, and many other people as well, and led to a backlash, really a moral panic that closed down this research in the late 60s, early 70s. So as enthusiasm builds around psychedelics and their potential, and I confess I'm responsible for that, some of that revival of interest.
Yes, you are.
It's, as time goes on, I've felt a little more the need to sound a cautionary note. Because the kind of model in people's minds is, this is the next cannabis. And indeed, you talk to drug policy reformers, and they often will say that they're following that playbook. And the playbook with cannabis, which I know hasn't been legalized here, but has been in California, where I live, in 9 other states, in a remarkably short amount of time, was that it was first established as a medicine. You had these medical marijuana initiatives, and that changed the image of it, and got it off of the Cheech and Chong image to something much more respectable. And then that paved the way for legalization. And I just, as a model, I don't know that psychedelics fits that well. It's a much more powerful drug than cannabis, and that things can go wrong. There are real risks involved here, psychological risks. So I think that a completely, a marketplace economy around psychedelics, which wouldn't just give access, but I've seen this in California, ends up pushing the drugs on people through clever marketing. It doesn't seem right in this case. And I'm not sure what does seem right, but the other worry is that we're on this path toward FDA approval, and we're pretty far down that path, and the FDA has been incredibly supportive. In fact, last year they granted breakthrough therapy designation to the use of psilocybin to treat depression. That means they're actively helping the researchers get to that point. Mm-hmm. And I don't want to fuck that up. So the other important difference with cannabis is there was a real social justice reason to decriminalize or legalize cannabis, and that was cannabis prosecution was at the heart of the drug war. There are hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of people, many of them African Americans, who are in jail because of 3 strikes, right? One of those strikes very often was a cannabis crime. It gave the police a very powerful tool to arrest people they wanted to arrest. And that ending mass incarceration went hand in hand with ending marijuana prohibition. So I don't see that, with psychedelics. I don't see that lots of people are being thrown in jail for psilocybin crimes, or that there's anything approaching mass incarceration around this. So I don't think it has the social justice urgency. So I'm inclined to stay on the path we're on. That said, if I lived in Denver, I would have voted for it, because it would be hypocritical of me, having used it and possessed it and cultivated it, to say other people shouldn't be allowed to. I don't think anyone should be arrested for using a mushroom of any kind, whether it's chanterelles or psilocybin.
Stay out of my kitchen.
Government out of my kitchen, right.
I was thinking, in the op-ed you say not everyone should take psychedelics, and they can have lasting effects and have really negative effects. You'll be quizzed later about how many of you have experienced a bad trip. But I thought about that, and I thought, well, you could say that about a lot of substances. You could say that about alcohol. You can do enormous damage. Not everyone should be drinking. You can say that maybe about cigarettes. You might be able to say that about pot and some of the strength of it now. So it seems like there's this tension in our culture where we're not supposed to take things that change our consciousness. But it's okay for all of us to be on antidepressants.
Yeah,
why? Why is
you're
that?
Right. Well, I mean, if you look at do a typology of drugs that are legal and drugs that are illegal, it really doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I mean, you have psychedelics are actually some of the most non-toxic drugs you can take, believe it or not. There's no lethal dose for psilocybin or LSD. You can't say that about many of the drugs in your medicine cabinet. Tylenol has a lethal dose measured in a couple dozen pills. So why is it there? Well, it's very threatening, I think, it was very threatening in the 60s to the Nixon administration. Nixon thought that it was LSD that was sapping the will of American boys to go off and fight, and he may have been partly right. It caused people to question, for most of human history, 18-year-old boys march off to war when you tell them to go. And suddenly that wasn't happening. That was pretty unprecedented. And it was also threatening, there was a huge generation gap in the 60s, and I think psychedelics had something to do with that, in that the young were having a rite of passage, and the LSD trip is a rite of passage, that the old were not familiar with, and I think that was very scary.
But you talked just a minute ago, you were saying that there's a social justice dimension to legalizing marijuana because of the way that it was used from Nixon on, even before that, to target specific populations, right? To target the anti-war movement.
Well, John Ehrlichman actually let the cat out of the bag. He gave a quote in Harper's Magazine that just surfaced in the last couple of years, but he gave the quote, I think, back in the 80s, and he said, "We needed the drug war to go after the blacks and the hippies."
Yeah. So
I mean, you can't be more blunt than that. And pot was the way to go after both of them, and psychedelics was the way to go after the hippies, by legalizing them.
Do you think, though, that it was a kind of anti-youth move in general? I mean, you talked about the war, and obviously there were all these other factors that led to the anti-war movement.
And the baby boom, too. You had this huge demographic bulge of young people that changed the culture. So that was part of it. But I do think it was destabilizing in certain ways. I mean, think about it. You had this the more distance we get on the 60s, the odder they are. You had a youth culture that withdrew from adult culture in certain ways, and it had its own ways of speaking, it had its own ways of dressing and mores and manners, and was trying to kind of be as different as it could be, and it had its own drugs, and the adults had their Mother's Little Helper that Rolling Stones talked about. They had tranquilizers and alcohol, they had depressants, and the young had psychedelics. So
little did we know how bad the mummy's helper was going to be, right?
Yeah.
I mean, Valium was probably a much more dangerous drug in some ways.
Yeah, but I mean, going back to this idea of why are some drugs legal and illegal, some lubricate society, right? I mean, coffee,
Make
right?
it work.
They help people work. They help people socialize. Alcohol in small amounts is a great social lubricant. The drugs that really disrupt things are the ones that often get banned. When caffeine first showed up, there were efforts to make that illegal, and then everybody realized, can't do that. It's too helpful. It's helping people stay up later, work harder. Capitalism likes this drug. And capitalism is figuring out how to like psychedelics now,
right,
with microdosing, of course. That's the way to, make it a acceptable capitalistic drug, because microdosing is essentially taking this incredibly Dionysian disruptive drug and turning it into another productivity drug. It's kind of perfect.
I wanted to ask you about your relationship to the counterculture. I mean, you didn't live it, but there's a real tension in this book around exactly the Dionysian dimension of LSD and that experience that people, or psychedelic mushrooms that people were tapping into, and that is seen as threatening, and you could talk a lot about American mores and all of that, and I know this book is an effort in a way to kind of pull off all that psychedelic draping,
yeah.
But what is your relationship to the counter? Like, do you see that as a legitimate hangover of LSD? Do you think that there was something that literally derailed LSD research and all of that? Do you have an ambivalence about that?
I mean, a lot of things went south after the 60s, and you can blame the 60s counterculture for all sorts of things, but I tend to stress the positive things. I mean, I think it gave us a lot of what we really prize, or at least what a lot of us really prize, such as the environmental movement, women's liberation, civil rights to some extent. These are products of the 60s, and we're still fighting about them. The amazing thing is that I just didn't think at this point in my life the terms of debate that were set in the 60s around personal liberation and questioning authority and all the kind of things we would still be arguing about. I mean, we are still in the backlash to the 60s.
Yeah.
The modern right is all about a backlash to the 60s. Abortion is a classic case. And I find it very sad that we're still having that battle, and I realize it's going to consume the rest of my life. And I thought, actually, when Obama was elected, in that moment in Grant Park, when the family came out, and I said this to Judith, and that maybe we finally turn the page, and something new is going to start. No,
Book's a lot longer than we thought.
Yeah, it's just going to take. So I think a lot of interesting historical, political forces were set in motion then, and they continue to reverberate in our culture. And so that psychedelics should return now, in a way, is kind of a return of the repressed. I mean, that they're coming back into our society has to do with the fact that they did have value, and people committed to them kept the flame alive.
Right, they kept
it was
going.
like a dark age, and really the flame was held at Esalen, this New Age conference center in California, where they never stopped talking about psychedelics, and I'm guessing using them, and then when things were ripe enough and you could restart the research, and the FDA allowed them to restart the research, it's sort of reflowering, and then you have the fact that the tech community, which wasn't true in the 60s, there really wasn't a tech community in that sense, became so interested in them. And that had to do with Burning Man, which is a kind of neo-60s event, I gather. I've never been. But, and that has cultivated a lot of interest in psychedelics. And frankly, the fact that we have a mental health crisis. That we have, one of the big surprises to me in doing this book was I thought psychiatry and the mental health world would be very critical and there'd be a lot of pushback. It's been the opposite. I mean, that they are so receptive, the people who've looked at the question, because they're in desperate need of new tools. And there's a general recognition in psychiatry that the pharmacological tools they have are really not adequate. They mostly treat symptoms. They have terrible side effects. They're addictive, very hard to get off, and people don't like taking them. And so, if you compare mental health care with any other branch of medicine, whether it's oncology, cardiology, infectious disease, have they reduced suffering and saved lives at the same rate? I don't think so. It's a harder problem. But that, I think, is fueling a lot of the interest, essentially a sense of desperation. And that if we have a tool that can really help people, not just address symptoms, but actually cure mental disorders, we can't turn away from that.
You said earlier that by writing this book, and then, publishing op-eds as things are happening around psychedelics, you've developed a sense of responsibility for what happens, right? And I'm not saying you're like Timothy Leary, although do you feel any connection to him? Not obviously in his sort of vision, but as someone who kind of really brought this into broad public consciousness.
There's a lot of cautionary lessons in the Timothy Leary story. I mean, he did kind of, he became an evangelist for psychedelics. He wanted simply to give them to as many people as possible. Yeah. He really thought, he calculated if 4 million Americans took LSD, we could change the society. In fact, only 2 million had by the end of the 60s, and they did change the society, but not exactly the way he thought. No, I don't identify with him at all. Look, I came to psychedelics very late in life. My experience is much more limited than, I don't know how many trips he had, but it was in the hundreds. And he became sort of a cult leader in certain ways. Mm-hmm. And I don't have a cult behind me. So
come on.
I do feel a sense of responsibility because I have the culture's ear on this subject right now.
Right, you do.
And when that, as I did with food, a few years ago, and once that's true, you have to think a little bit beyond your own curiosity and your own interest in personal growth and to what effect might what you're writing and saying have on other people. And, people will write me all the time and tell me that they read the book and they went out and tried this or that, and, I always get a little nervous. How'd it go? Are you okay? And sometimes they're not okay. I mean, sometimes you hear about, kind of scary stories people had. So I do feel a little sense of responsibility, and that's why I'm always sure to, talk to people about risk as well as benefits.
Well, not to put you on the spot, but given that you are in this position, one of the first questions that we got, so I have my questions, but many of you submitted questions in advance of the program, and thank you for those, and so I'm going to weave a few of those into this conversation. And the first one comes from Nick, and I think goes back to where we started with the op-ed. And he says, let's say you were somehow given broad legislative authority in the United States on this topic, how would you approach some of its details, and what would the end state of affairs look like?
Great question. And the answer is I'm not sure exactly. I mean, basically, here's how I see the future of psychedelics. We have this medical model, this medicalization container. And the way that's going to work, assuming it's approved, which I think will happen in the next 5 to 7 years, say, that you will be able, working with an MD or probably a psychiatrist, you will be able to get a psychedelic session if you have certain, if you're depressed, if you're perhaps have cancer, a cancer diagnosis. That was a very successful trial that happened. If you have anxiety, and if you're an addict. And what that will consist of, and this seems to be the model that's developing, is a guided psychedelic trip where you work with 2 therapists, a man and a woman, very intensely, but for a very short amount of time. And so they prepare you very carefully for the experience. They also qualify you for it. They make sure you're not at risk of schizophrenia. That's a disqualifying if you have that in your family history. And if you're on certain psychiatric medicines, they don't want you, not so much, well, partly for drug interaction, but also because SSRIs blunt the effect of
Right.
psychedelics.
Danavir.
And getting off of SSRIs is risky as it is. And then they also tell you what to do if you have a bad trip, or what they would call a challenging trip. And that if you're really frightened, go to what's frightening you. If you feel like you're going crazy, or your mind's dissolving, or you see a monster, go with it, surrender. That's the key thing. Relax your mind and float downstream, as John Lennon advised us. And then during the experience, they sit with you the whole time, and they don't say very much. They're not trying to direct the experience, but they're there to hold your hand if you're getting really upset, or help you get up and go to the bathroom, or whatever, give you a sip of water. And then afterwards, you come back a day later or 2 days later, and you have what's called an integration session, where they help you make sense of what happened. So that's the medical model as it's evolving, and it seems to be very effective for those indications. So that's one side. Okay, so for people with mental illness and dealing with crises, we have that, and addiction. On the other end, we have a religious model. Cultures have been using psychedelics for thousands of years, and some of them still are. So you have the ayahuasca model, which comes from the Amazon. It's a very powerful psychedelic. DMT is the drug, but it's a tea made from several different plants, 2 different plants, but different varieties can qualify. And there are 2 ayahuasca churches in America that have chapters all over the country. They're not that well known, and if you join that church, they administer ayahuasca as a sacrament, and they're legally entitled to do that under separation of church and state, and something called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act that was passed under the Clinton administration. And the Native American Church also, which is an indigenous, it's multi-tribe church that I think about 150 American tribes are part of now, and they can use peyote in their ceremonies legally. So you have this religious model, you have this medical model, and then there's the rest of us, who perhaps are not suffering from a mental illness diagnosis, are not in these churches. What one of my sources, immortally referred to as, the betterment of well people, which I think is an awkwardly lovely phrase. And so what about us? How will we get access? And that's the hard part. I don't know exactly how to design that. Now, there is going to be a ballot initiative in Oregon that will take a stab at this. 2 psychologists started this, and they designed a regime for the state health authorities to, if it passes, to train therapists, most of whom are now working underground illegally, to give them a certain kind of training and an exam and a license, and they will be allowed to give psilocybin to anyone they want to, anybody who wants to take it. They don't have to have a diagnosis. It won't be covered by insurance. And we'll see. I mean, is that the best way to design this? But basically, we have this really interesting cultural project that I don't know the answer to, which is, how do we create a container for people to use this in a way that's safe and won't be subject to the kinds of things that happen in an underground very often, and that there's so I'm curious about that. But the other thing I can easily imagine happening, and this is not something I would design, but will happen, is that there will be clinics, and they'll be a little like spas, and they'll have a psychiatrist on staff. They'll be like mental health clubs, and you will go there, and if you're qualified, if they do your history, they will give you a guided trip, and the psychiatrist will, write the prescription. That might, I just talked to a group in Canada that wants to design those clinics right now.
I mean, I guess that leads to the question, which comes back to social justice, is in that vision, or even in the stuff that you were documenting writing this book, are the right people getting access? Will the right people get access, or does this become a kind of like elite, rich person's elite experience? Because that even happened in the first wave, right? Like drug company was giving tons of LSD to all these researchers. You barely had to be qualified to get it, but then they would do these trials with it or facilitate people's experience and charge like $500.
Yeah, so, and more now. So the virtue, I mean, one of the considerable virtues of going down this legalization path is that it will, once it's approved by the FDA and rescheduled by the DEA, it will be covered by insurance. So people presumably with health insurance, with Medicaid, will have access to it. So in a way, the medical model democratizes it most effectively, I think. These spas, or these clinics will be, I'm sure, expensive. Right now, though, it's interesting that, I mean, one of the things I explore in the book is this underground, which is an informal network of very serious therapists who are practicing illegally because they believe so strongly in this. And they actually have a code of conduct, which I've read. You can find it online. And part of that is that you charge people what they can afford. So they overcharge affluent people and they undercharge people who are poor. That said, though, the psychedelic world is pretty white and pretty affluent. And I was doing an event like this the other night with an African-American writer and psychonaut, very rare. He founded the People of Color camp at Burning Man, which I didn't even know existed. And we had an interesting conversation about why that should be so. And what came out of it was a couple things, which is that the African-American community has very conservative attitudes toward drugs in general, and that they've seen crack cocaine and heroin wreck their communities. And
the criminalization.
And the criminalization,
right? Like
absolutely. And how drugs were
yeah.
used as a tool of oppression in African-American communities. So there's a real skepticism. And then you have the legacy of Tuskegee and the medical experiments performed on African Americans. And there's a story I tell in the book, it's actually just a footnote, where Timothy Leary, he had a series of pretty wild experiments. One was he wanted to give it to hardened criminals at the Concord State Prison to see if he could lower the recidivism rate. And in those days, avoiding the Tuskegee image, I guess, he said, well, the researchers will take the drugs with the prisoners. So they're not treated like guinea pigs. It was a wild time. And he's sitting there with this African-American who was a murderer or a rapist or something, but a very tough character. And he sees that, and he's really nervous, because what's this guy going to do when he gets, when he goes off on his trip? And he says to the guy, I'm really nervous. And the prisoner said, well, I'm nervous too. And he says, why are you nervous? He said, because you're a fucking mad scientist. But the other reason I think that came out of this conversation was that to use psychedelics, Leary said, and this was his big contribution, set and setting are very important. You have to be in an environment where you feel maximally safe in your body to let your mind go there, go as far away as it's going to go. And a great many African Americans don't feel that. They feel alert, and the need to be alert because of encounters with the police, and not having an environment where you could let go for 6 or 8 hours. And that I think, too, has made it a pretty unappealing drug in that community.
So we're 40 minutes in, and I have to segue to the part of the program I'm going to call Michael Pollan on drugs, because I know people want to talk about this. So I have a couple of questions, and then I'm going to ask questions from people who submitted them. So my question is just, what was your favorite part of getting high?
I don't think of it as getting high. I mean, that word just seems more appropriate to cannabis or alcohol than psychedelics.
Tripping?
Tripping, journeying, yeah. I think that's better. I mean, you really do go places. You don't feel high necessarily. It's just much more complicated than that. Favorite part? When it's all over. I really enjoyed the end of the experiences, having, it's like safely returning home, but with all this new information. So one of my favorite parts after these experiences was coming home, and Judith, my wife, and I would have a dinner, and I would tell her the whole story of what happened, and she would help me make sense of it. And that was kind of a highlight. But there were definitely moments of incredible power and emotion. Mostly on psilocybin. I would say I had my best experiences on psilocybin. It doesn't mean I couldn't have had better experiences on LSD or ayahuasca, but for one reason or another, the circumstance was just right. And I had, I guess the happiest experience was an unguided psilocybin trip at our home in New England, and walking through my garden and seeing it with new eyes. One of the really interesting things that happens on psychedelics is everything feels alive, much more alive than it ever has. I mean, inanimate things can feel alive, but plants, to me especially. And we were talking about an earlier book of mine, Botany of Desire, which is very much about, the subtitle is A Plant's Eye View of the World. And the premise of it, or the intellectual conceit, is that domesticated plants manipulate us even as we manipulate them, that they have their own subjectivity or agency in evolution. And I understood that idea intellectually, but during this trip, I felt it. I felt the plants returning my gaze. I felt them being conscious beings, not like us, they weren't talking or anything, but that they had their own awareness of the environment, their own agency, their own subjectivity. We go through life thinking we are the only thinking subject, and maybe there's a handful of people we accord that privilege to in our lives. We tend to objectify, though, even people, but we definitely objectify nature. And it's a great power. It's an ego. It's the ego's power to objectify the other. Because once you've objectified the other, you can exploit it, you can make use of it, you can be instrumental about it. Mm-hmm. And on psychedelics, everything is subjective. Everything has a subjectivity. And it was a beautiful moment. And I walked out to this building that I built that was the subject of my second book, A Place of My Own, and I sat at the desk there, and I was looking out, and there were these two trees that, I had cited the building to frame these two trees. One was this very elegant white oak, and the other was this ash tree that was sort of beat up and lost a lot of limbs and was kind of stout. And I realized for the first time, oh, that's my mother and that's my father. And their spirit was in those trees. And at the time, they were both still alive. And but it was so vivid, like, why didn't you know that before? And that tree had my mother's kind of elegance, and she's very thin and long arms. And the beat-up old ash tree was very much like my dad, who at the time was ill. And that was, so I was kind of communing with them, and then made my way back through the garden, and I never felt more a part of nature than I did on that walk. I think most of us feel that we're slightly removed, even when we're having a powerful nature experience. We're not in it entirely. We have
right,
one
and
foot
you've
in.
had many powerful nature
I have,
experiences.
and I feel strongly connected, especially to plants. And but here, we speak of our relationship to nature, and just even that word betrays the fact that we're not in it, right? And we feel like we're part out of it. To have a relationship with something, you can't be it. And that all went away. I was completely part and parcel of that scene. I was one species among many, and all the species were being incredibly nice to me. They were very benign. They liked me. Of course, I had planted them and taken care of them, but they owed me. But so that was, I would say, the most ecstatic experience.
Eric Garten asked, having experienced multiple psychedelics, you kind of answered this, but are you inclined to repeat any of them? If yes, which ones and why? And if not, why?
Well, I hasten to point out it's illegal, and I have been very open about my use, and therefore somewhat legally vulnerable. So I have not done anything since the book. I look forward to the day when I can again, but I've been very careful. And if they were decriminalized, if there were some regime, I could easily see doing psilocybin again, maybe experimenting with a higher dose of LSD. The thing about LSD that sort of scares me is what people say about it is, it's amazing for 6 hours, and then it goes on another 6 hours. So I kind of like the scale of a psilocybin trip, which is 4 to 6 hours. And I could see doing this on my birthday every year as like a really kind of good way to take stock of where you are in life and set your intentions for the future. And
do you see, you talk about microdosing in the book, and I can see that might be a great application, because part of the challenge is dosing and how long you're involved in that experience. That could be amazing for people as they're aging, or people with dementia. Or does that appeal to you, or do you think that's kind of just a trend that's part of us getting engaged with psychedelics
I think the jury's out. I didn't do a lot on microdosing in the book for the reason that I really stuck pretty close to the science and the research, and everything is really rooted in that. And frankly, there's no good research on microdosing yet. There is a lot of anecdotal work. There's a psychologist who's collected thousands of reports from people who are following a microdosing regime of, you take it, it's like a tenth of a normal dose of LSD or psilocybin. You take it once every 3 or 4 days. Mm-hmm. And they keep journals for him, and they report improvements in mood and productivity and creativity. But that could all be placebo effect. There's a very powerful placebo effect with molecules like psychedelics because they're so magic in our minds. Now, there's nothing wrong with a placebo effect, but I'm curious to know, in a controlled trial where some people are getting a placebo and some people are getting the microdose, are there differences observed then? And we don't know the answer to that yet. So everybody's doing this, on faith.
I wanted to ask you if you think one of the dangers of returning to psychedelics, which is happening, is the way they were misused, not by someone like Timothy Leary, but by the government, by the CIA and the mind control experiments. You mentioned in the book, as you said, but you don't go into the kind of outcome of, I don't know, a lot of that research was destroyed, but there was a Senate investigation. It took place in the period of time that you're looking at, that first wave, 53 to 73, and they experimented on people with drugs. Some people knew they were taking drugs, but many people did not. And, you talk about we know what the repercussions of that have been, and I just wonder, is that a concern that you have in this sort of openness? How are we going to regulate this? How are we going to legislate it? Do you have any anxiety about these other kinds of use of psychedelic drugs to control? Because one of the factors of it, or the elements of it, is that the susceptibility that you're under, that you can be...
Suggestibility,
yes, thanks.
Well, you have the case of Charles Manson, who supposedly used LSD in his cult.
But the CIA was working with major universities, institutions, prisons,
the CIA
hospitals.
funded a lot of the research. The researchers didn't realize who was funding them, but there were these various front foundations that paid for a lot of LSD research in the 50s. No, the whole time that there was this, very well-intentioned therapeutic research going on through the 50s and 60s, the CIA had its own program. And they were trying to figure out, and basically because the Nazis had used mescaline, and they thought the Russians were also using some psychedelics, which may have been true, that they wanted to, that there was an arms race around psychedelics, basically. And they were trying to figure out what might they be good for? How could we weaponize them, in effect? And they went through a series of different ideas. One was that it was a truth serum. You would give LSD to somebody, or psilocybin, and they would not be able to lie to you. But of course, they said all sorts of crazy stuff. It was not good, didn't work. And then they thought it could be, you could sneak it to world leaders and get them to do foolish things, a la the exploding cigar for Castro and things like that. And I don't think that worked very well.
I think people still have that fantasy, though.
Yes, but the crazy thing could include pressing the button, the nuclear button. So I didn't understand why that was a good strategy. And then mind control. That was another one, that you could get people to do things by suggesting things to them. They did some really just morally abhorrent things, including dosing people without their permission. They set up a brothel in both New York and San Francisco where they would dose the Johns and watch what happened. And so it was really awful research. And that when that came out in the early 70s, and there was the church hearings and some other hearings around it, that did contribute to the backlash. So I think a really important question about psychedelics is that the kind of cultural valence they have, like there was a study done in England that showed that nature connectedness rises, right? How connected you do. My experience is not unusual, that goes up. Tolerance for authoritarianism goes down. And there are researchers there, including one I profile in the book, Robin Carhart Harris, who thinks they have a basically positive social or political import. But I think that has a lot to do with the people who are giving them to people and the kinds of people they're giving them to. I think that it's potential they could be used as in a negative way. I think that potential is there.
Did you come across in the people you were meeting and the research you were doing anyone who'd been involved in?
No.
Yeah.
No, those people aren't around, or they're really undercover. And the problem is we only know a little bit about it.
Right.
We assume all the experiments failed, for example, but maybe one of them didn't. Oh, the other was to put it in the water supply for, enemy countries and disable the population using LSD.
It's just fascinating because there's so much, at least in popular culture, that seems to still be trying to work out that aspect of our history of psychedelics. Movies like Jacob's Ladder or that new series Homecoming, and so in some ways,
Errol Morris's did a great series called Wormwood, which was about, it seemed to be about the CIA experiments. It was about a guy who was given given LSD by the CIA without his permission, supposedly went crazy and jumped out of a window in New York 3 days later. But Morris kind of suggests that was a cover story for something much darker. Mm-hmm. It's a great film. It's on Netflix if you haven't seen it.
So I was curious about your decision to try different psychedelics, to me, is of a piece with your work, which is very drawn to the experiential. You've hunted and gathered and designed and built houses. You've done all kinds of things. You've followed in the footprints of some of the people that you write about, living or not. And why is that important to your writing and to you?
Yeah. I do like finding a way to use the first person. I'm not a confessional writer. I mean, this is my most personal book by far, but I just find it's a really interesting tool to find a productive way to put yourself in the story and a place to stand that gives you a perspective that nobody else has. I realized much later that I had gotten this from a writer I read when I was a teenager, George Plimpton, who was a sports writer. And he wrote a book I just loved when I was like 13 called Paper Lion. And he was the editor of the Paris Review, and he wrote for Sports Illustrated, and he wanted to essentially revive or revivify sports writing, which had fallen into a very kind of, the cigar-chomping guy on the sideline who's, very cynical, has been there, seen it all. And he got the idea of getting on the field. And he somehow persuaded the Detroit Lions to let him go through summer training camp and then start as a quarterback in one of their exhibition games. Very dangerous, and more dangerous now than in the 60s, but and he wrote about this with incredible vividness and humor. And there are people. I mean, you could get a football player, you could get a quarterback to write a book, but of course he's done it so many times he doesn't see it freshly anymore. And there is that wonder that comes from doing something for the first time that you never get again. And so even though there's so many more experienced psychonauts than me, I knew that having done LSD for the first time with the intention of writing about it would give me a perspective that would be valuable to write about. Plus, I'm curious. I mean, in all these things, I'm curious to know, what is it like to do this? What is it like to build? What is it like to, own a cow that you're following through the meat system? And it gives you comic possibilities too. And I think humor is really important no matter what you're writing about. And since you're a fish out of water, you're essentially creating a fish out of water or man from Mars kind of narrative. And there's often comic possibility, but there's also a quality of wonder you can capture that you can't get any other way. I could have interviewed, I had amazing interviews. The people who use psychedelics, some of them are very eloquent about what happened to them. It's such a transformative experience for them, and such an indelible experience. They remember everything about it. It's not like a dream at all. And I had these great interviews, but the more I talked to people, I was like, I wonder how this would be for me. And I became, for various personal reasons, where I was in my life, the fact that I was doing this work when my dad had a cancer diagnosis and was dying, and I was interviewing cancer patients who had an experience that removed their fear and that completely reset their attitude toward their mortality, and allowed them to talk about death in a way so few of us can, with just openness and candor. And it was a conversation I really couldn't have with my father, who processed it very internally. I still don't know exactly how he processed it. He died a year ago in January. Yesterday was his birthday. So I really wanted to see what this was about. I was just burning with curiosity. But I knew as a literary matter that this would be good for the book, and that it's what my readers expect me to do, so I did it for you.
One of the things that I like about you two in your writing is, so you talk about, there's the psychonauts, but there's the myco-evangelists, like the irrationally exuberant people that you referenced before. It's a trope in your work, I don't know if trope's the right word, a recurring theme, a recurring thing, that you're a little suspicious of those people who've drunk the Kool-Aid. Yeah. Rightly so.
But I love them too.
You love them too. Like Paul Stamets is a great character in this book. Well worth reading just for the scenes with him. But I was thinking this goes back to, we were talking backstage about how so many of the ideas that are coming to fruition in this book were ones you were thinking about when you wrote Botany of Desire. And what's his name? William Ellery Jones, the Johnny Appleseed.
Yeah.
And you're a little merciless with him. Like he's just got this story of Johnny Appleseed, and he's going to stick with it. But I'm curious because you have a healthy sense of skepticism, and I suppose some of that has to do with evolving into a journalist. But where else does it come from? I mean, is this something about your childhood?
Yeah, that's interesting. I do have skepticism, and I think that's been really important on a subject like this, where so many readers have skepticism too. Yeah. And that most of the books written on psychedelics are written by people who drank the Kool-Aid a long time ago, and are inside the community and assume their readers know the territory and everybody's on the same page. And I just don't write that way. I like to write, this is in a way a subculture book, and I like coming in from outside and having my doubts, and I think that becomes a proxy for the reader. Yeah. And it makes it easier for the reader to go into it. So it serves a rhetorical purpose too, but I really did have my doubts. I was too afraid to use these drugs in the 60s. I didn't do it. I just didn't think I was sturdy enough. I'd read all the scare stories, people jumping off of buildings and staring at the sun till they go blind. And I came of age once those stories were in the culture. And so I was a very reluctant psychonaut. And before every one of my experiences, I had a sleepless night of anxiety, of like ping-ponging back and forth, like, are you crazy? You're 60 years old. You're going to go up on that mountain with that guy you just met. He's completely off the grid, and you're going to do this drug. And like, what if you have a heart attack? Is he going to call 911? And then on this other side, this other voice saying, but aren't you curious what you might learn? And you've got a book to write. And it would go back and forth like that. And fortunately, the other voice won. And I came to recognize the first voice as my ego, which our egos command our rational faculties, and this is an enormous threat to the ego. And my ego knew that it was about to come under assault, and so was defending itself. Right. So the reluctance was a real thing, but I think it served a purpose in terms of helping readers get comfortable with a very uncomfortable subject.
You say there are other ways to achieve this dissolution of the ego, meditation, maybe wild dancing, fasting, praying. There's all kinds of
certain
routes.
Kinds of breath work. Yeah,
that you did as well. That we have a question from a woman named Jen who asks, do you escape your ego when writing?
Intermittently. I mean, there's an experience called flow, by a sociologist with a very long name that nobody can pronounce. Some of you know who he is. Flow is that quality of becoming so immersed in a task that all self-consciousness vanishes and you are just so present to it. And my guess is we'll someday, if we can put those people in a fMRI scanner, we'll see that something similar is going on, that they are quieting the same network in the brain, the default mode network, which appears to be implicated in psychedelic experience and also meditation. So one of the really interesting neuroscientific findings was when they first started putting people in MRI machines and then giving them a shot of LSD or psilocybin, and imagine that, right? I mean, these volunteers deserve our thanks. I mean, going in an MRI machine stone cold sober is terrifying. And they took pictures of their brains, and they were very surprised to find that instead of activating everything as they thought was happening, it deactivated something called the default mode network, which is closely associated with self-reflection and time travel and theory of mind. All those things having to do with the construction of a self went quiet. And the degree to which it went quiet correlated precisely with the degree to which people reported my ego was obliterated or dissolved. And then they did the same thing with meditators, different lab, totally different protocols. And they put in people who had 10,000 hours of meditation, and the same brain networks were quieted, which is really interesting considering the experience is different, but it has in common that loss of a sense of ego.
But you don't think we're going to be having a national conversation, as you said in the op-ed, about meditation, right? I mean, we're drawn to these...
Well, in a way, and we have in a kind of quiet way without frightening anybody. I mean, it's very interesting how far mindfulness has come. That's kind of the neutral descriptor for Buddhist meditation. It's now covered by insurance, mindfulness programs if you have high blood pressure. And so the culture has embraced that. But it's also interesting to learn that the roots of mindfulness and Buddhism in America are psychedelics. That all the important American Buddhists, the people who brought Buddhism to America, started out on LSD and psilocybin. I've interviewed a bunch of them, and they're pretty candid about it now. There was a little discomfort for a few years in talking about it because there's a prohibition on intoxicants. But they had this altered form of consciousness, this experience of ego loss, and they wanted to figure out how to bring that kind of consciousness into everyday life because you can't trip every day. How do you make it a practice? Well, meditation is a way to make it a practice. And indeed, the psychedelic experience is very helpful to meditation in that it gives you a sense of the kind of consciousness you're striving for. Mm-hmm. And I talked to one meditation researcher who did those fMRIs of meditators, and he says he could imagine a day where we would use psychedelics to kickstart a meditation practice. Because people don't know where they're supposed to go. The destination is so fuzzy, and it's not after you've had psychedelic experience. And I found in my own case, I became a much more faithful and effective meditator after my psychedelic experiences. So I think it's a very logical progression and a healthy progression, because I don't think you want to do these drugs on a weekly basis like your friend did growing up.
I wanted to ask you, when you talk about the American story of psychedelics involves other cultures and other specific rituals and practices, and there's a great and disturbing story in the book about, is it R. Gordon Wasson, who writes an article in the 50s for Life magazine. Henry Luce, the founder of Time and Life, is a big proponent of LSD. So he goes to southern Mexico to the Mazatec, and he meets this woman, Maria Sabina. And she takes him through the ritual, and then he takes that back, writes about it, and then writes a book and kind of exposes where this is happening, and so then everybody goes there,
and that culture was trashed.
It was trashed,
Yeah.
and even Timothy Leary, his first psychedelic experience was going to Mexico.
Yeah, on psilocybin.
Yeah, and we think now of Mexico, we were talking about the drug war, as the center of the drug war, but it's been this well in multiple ways for Americans to tap into different rituals,
Yeah.
different cultures, and different drugs. Do you think that we have to have a reckoning with that history that you write about
I think
as
there
we
is,
move toward a kind of cultural acceptance?
There's a cultural appropriation that goes on too,
Yeah.
without question, and that happened with psilocybin. There were these mushroom cults, and we call a religion a cult when we don't like it. But when the conquistadors came to Mexico, they found that the native population was using psilocybin in their rituals, and there are these wonderful accounts of what it looked like. And they called psilocybin Teonatecatl, which meant flesh of the gods. So it was a sacrament. And that's, of course, what the Christian sacrament is. Bread is the flesh of God. And that was very threatening to the Catholic Church. And because, frankly, the psilocybin sacrament worked a lot better. You didn't need faith. You really saw God. You met him or it.
Direct channel.
So they crushed this brutally.
Right.
They tortured people who were using mushrooms, and it went underground and survived for 500 years underground with no one being aware of it in Mexico. And Gordon Wasson, who was this banker from New York and an amateur mycologist, rediscovered it and had the first trip. But yeah, what happened in its wake is you had a generation of seekers, Beat Generation people, hippies going to Huautla de Jimenez, this town where she was, and commercializing it, and it really did. And the women of the town, the people of the town turned on Maria Sabina, and they burned down her house for having done this, for having ruined their town. We're seeing a little of that with ayahuasca now, too. And so that's a concern. It's interesting that the indigenous Americans who use peyote have done a much better job of defending their cultural use against Westerners, in that they don't allow many people to participate. They don't sell the peyote to anybody outside. They're not going around organizing circles in Brooklyn for peyote the way there's certain shamans doing that from South America. So yeah, I think we have. I think that the indigenous traditional uses of these drugs have a lot to teach us about how to use them well.
Or even what science or spirituality or knowledge is, right?
Yeah, and so, but it seems to me there's a way to use that knowledge without abusing it.
Yeah.
And so people do study that example. And, when we were talking earlier about designing this container for psilocybin or LSD, I think we should look at those models because there's a lot of wisdom there. There's, many more years of trial and error. These drugs burst on our culture in the 50s and 60s, and they didn't come with an instruction manual, and we didn't know what to do, and there was a lot of reckless use and experimentation, putting in the punch bowls and, the acid test idea. I was like, that's kind of crazy. So what do you learn from traditional use? Well, you seldom do it alone. Only the shaman ever takes the drugs alone. There's always a shaman or an elder or a healer involved, someone who knows the territory to guide people. It's always done on a very special occasion with a very clear intention. It's approached with real reverence, not casual in any way. So I think there are things we can learn from those examples, but I also think we should preserve those examples and helping the indigenous Americans using peyote, preserving their access to peyote, which is running out. There's a real shortage for them. And those conservation efforts, I think, are really important. And wherever else we find these kind of traditional uses, I think we have to protect them.
Reading this book, the history of psychedelics is a history of knowledge, how knowledge is produced, how it can be suppressed, how it comes back. It's fascinating on that level. And one of the things that's really fascinating about psychedelics is the way it kind of breaks down, even as we're trying to keep it in a container, or multiple containers to regulate it or control it, it really is about breaking down.
Breaks
and you
out
said it kind of
containers.
takes away that binary thinking that we're all trapped in. And one of the binaries you were interested going into this project was that between science and spirituality, and whether they could cross-pollinate and have something to say to one another. Do you feel that that desire you have is happening as we move into that broader conversation about psychedelics?
Yeah, I think that's one of the most interesting things, is that it is bringing science and spirituality in contact with one another in a way I didn't think was possible. I thought these were totally incommensurate vocabularies for understanding reality. And the very first paper that I described that really launches this psychedelic renaissance, it was this paper that came out of Johns Hopkins lab in 2006, which I encourage you to read. It's a wonderful paper, and the title was like, "Psilocybin can occasion mystical-like experiences in healthy, normal people." You know, really, mystical, like a science paper about mystical experience. How curious. But it turns out, and mystical experience is defined, you know, beginning with William James as, you know, involving ego dissolution, transcendence of space and time, sense of well-being or ecstasy, and a couple other qualities. It appears we're wired for this experience. And that's interesting as a scientific matter. Why would we be? Why would it be adaptive that our brains can go to this place, this form of consciousness? Because we can achieve it spontaneously. Very religious people achieve it. People doing other things like meditation achieve it. And that's a very curious fact about us. And there's a history of mystical experience that goes back thousands of years. Ditto the near-death experience, you know, which has a lot of commonalities. Maybe that has a chemistry too. And so I think that we're in the next few years, we're going to learn some really incredible things about the mind, about spiritual experience, about the ego that we didn't know. And it's going to be because of these drugs and the probe they give us into the brain. You know, science has been stymied trying to make sense of consciousness, right? It does not have tools to really reach consciousness. The subjective experience of, you know, being who you are, which is more real to us than just about anything. Weirdly enough, science has no access to that except our reports of what it feels like, or what blue looks like to us, or what love feels like to us. One of the things that psychedelics do is, by disturbing consciousness radically as they do, they help force it to yield some of its secrets. And I think there is a rush of really smart scientists who've gotten interested in psychedelics. And we haven't heard from them yet. I mean, there's this first generation of very courageous scientists who risked their career to do this research, most of which is clinical. But now you're going to see neuroscientists doing basic science, working with psychedelics to see what secrets of consciousness can be teased out. And I'm really excited by that. I mean, I think in the next 5 or 10 years, we're going to know a lot more than we do right now.
Well, I hope you'll continue to be our guide and statesman on that journey. Thank you so much, Michael Pollan.
Thank you,
it was
Alison.
such a pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for your question. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone, for coming.